Well, hello and welcome to the IEA's YouTube channel. I'm Annabel Denham. I'm Director of Communications at the Institute of Economic Affairs, and I'm joined today by our Head of Political Economy, Dr. Kristian Niemietz, and by Jonathan Kitson, who recently co-authored the Adam Smith Institute paper, Worth a Shot, a link to which is in the description below. Now, before Christmas, the power of science brought a glimmer of light at the end of a grim and dark year. While vaccine development is typically an expensive, slow and laborious process, the solution to our COVID woes had been created with unprecedented speed. The UK, possibly among the most incompetent countries at managing the pandemic, was the first to administer a vaccine. Since then, however, a lethargic approach to rollout has blunted that triumph. But before looking forward to how we can drastically accelerate this process, I'd like to briefly rewind to early December and start with a quote from Pfizer's CEO outlining why the American drugs company declined government funding. He said, "I wanted to liberate our scientists from any bureaucracy. When you get money from someone, that always comes with strings. They want reports. I didn't want to have any of that. Basically, I gave them an open checkbook so that they can worry about only scientific challenges, not anything else. And also, I wanted to keep Pfizer out of politics, by the way." Kristian, could you explain a little about what might have led Pfizer's CEO to make this comment and why the development of the COVID vaccine can be seen as a victory for the free market?
I guess if you are an absolute libertarian purist who doesn't want any government involvement in anything whatsoever, then you would have a hard time trying to claim this as a victory for your side, because clearly there is government involvement, not least in the form that the purchasers of the vaccine are all governments. Of course, it's not being purchased, and at least not until now, by private health insurance companies, for example. So, of course, the government is a major actor in all this. But nonetheless, I think it's not a coincidence that it's been developed by private companies. It would, in principle, be imaginable that state-owned enterprises would come up with something like this, and who knows, maybe that will happen. That some state-owned pharmaceutical company somewhere comes up with a comparable product over the course of this year or the next. But from what I know about pharmaceutical research, it's mostly stumbling in the dark. Most research projects fail. Most initial leads that they have turn out to be dead ends. And so you have to have the ability in that sector to quickly pull the plug and not try to throw good money after bad money. And I think that's something that governments are just not good at. Imagine the public outcry we would have if the government said, okay, we've spent a couple of millions on investigating a particular compound. We've now come to the realization that it probably won't lead to anything, so we'll just pull the plug on this and cut our losses, see this as a sunk cost, and we will do something else. This is what private pharmaceutical companies do all the time. I don't think government-owned enterprises would be any good at that. So, yeah, on the whole, of course, you can imagine state-owned enterprises developing pharmaceuticals. The Soviet Union had pharmaceutical companies. East Germany had pharmaceutical companies. It's not impossible, but all the cutting-edge research and the innovation, the innovative drugs come from the private sector, and I think that's not a coincidence. That has something to do with the incentive system.
Thanks. And I'll stay with you, Kristian, because in a similar vein, some have been incandescent that pharma companies could profit from this crisis. Owen Jones wrote in The Guardian that the pharmaceutical industry has long made exorbitant profits by free riding on research carried out by the public sector. This is, he said, an egregious case of socialism for the rich. How might you go about rebutting such claims?
Yeah, first of all, being pro-market doesn't mean that one should be uncritically pro-big pharma. There are some issues in that sector. We can see, for example, that profit margins of large pharmaceutical companies are a lot higher than the profit margins of comparable companies in other sectors. So can be almost twice as high. And that does show that there is an issue with market power. And these are all things that we can talk about and that probably need addressing, need some kind of reform. But it's not the benefiting from publicly funded research that I'm worried about, because the whole point of publicly funded research is that it is available to anybody. Anybody can use it for any purpose. You can use the results of publicly funded research for the pure enjoyment of knowledge, if that's what you want to do, but you can also use it to make money. So especially someone like Owen Jones, who would be, I'm guessing, very much in favor of publicly funded research, where he wants to nationalize pretty much everything. So of course he would, among many other things, he would want research to be government directed and government funded. As long as you're in favor of that, you can't then blame companies for making use of some of the knowledge that is found in that way. And more broadly, I would say that there is a big difference between coming up with the broad outlines of a technology and turning that into a usable product, turning that into something that can be used by consumers on a day-to-day basis. More generally, the proponents of industrial policy, people like Mariana Mazzucato, make this case all the time that some of the consumer products we're using, consumer electronics like smartphones, make use in some indirect way of knowledge that has been created, among other things, with government-funded research. Okay, that may be so, but that doesn't show us that we would be better off if the government also took over the production and marketization of the products resulting from that, because coming up with the general outlines of a technology and then turning that into a product that we can use on a day-to-day basis, there's a world of difference here. And that is where you really need the private sector and especially the competitive process. That is how, for example, all computer products, computer programs that may not be super innovative, may have been around for decades, but then became user-friendly. It's that process of market competition which made that possible. So it's wrong to say that just because somebody draws in some way on knowledge that has been generated through publicly funded research, that they're all free riders and that they're not really producing anything. That would be a massive false conclusion. And it's not just socialists who make that point. You wouldn't be surprised that Owen Jones says this, but it is also true of the hyper purists on the free market side, where you also get people saying that as soon as a company has some contact in some shape or form with a government agency, it's not really a free market outcome. It's just crony capitalism. But I'm not convinced by that, simply because in a mixed economy like ours, where the state has such a large role and is involved in so many things, you can't avoid at some point having some contact with the government agency. You can't just, okay, the Pfizer did it in this case where as you said, where they did say we're not taking government money specifically for this, but of course, if you look for it, you will find some contacts between Pfizer and government agencies. Such as in a mixed economy like ours, that's just inevitable.
And just moving away from vaccine development, sort of as a scientific endeavour, Jonathan, of course, you anticipated the approval of a COVID vaccine before many of us, including me. I think we discussed it on an episode of Live with Littlewood together. But back in November, you also you voiced concern that the government's vaccination plan might have a fatal flaw. If the vaccine could only weaken the severity of the illness, you argued, it would make sense to inoculate those most at risk, those most vulnerable. But if it mitigated transmissibility, then might we be better to vaccinate those most likely to spread the virus, say older school children? But now we have the vaccine. I just wondered what you make of the government's broad approach.
So the absolute excuse me, the absolute fatal flaw that I was talking about in the initial plan for vaccination in Great Britain was they were only planning on vaccinating over 50s. Now the government changed that, they overruled the committee, and the updated plan is much better. So now what they have is a series of priorities and phases. Now there is some evidence that there's some evidence that the vaccine does reduce transmissibility, but I think at the moment, given that deaths are and cases are really increasing and don't really see as we speak at the moment aren't dropping. I think continuing on the priority list in terms of mortality risk is probably the best approach.
But of course, there has been a risk that the government might deviate from that. I mean, you wrote in CapEx this week that teachers shouldn't be fast-tracked in the vaccine queue, despite some arguing that they should be moved up the priority list.
Yeah, so teachers is probably the best example of a group of people who you might want to advance up the priority list. Now, there were some initial articles and tweets and comments suggested that they be placed on the same priority as frontline healthcare workers, which I think would be deeply misguided. There are 500,000 teachers in the country, and that over the next few weeks we are going to see shortage, real restriction on the number of vaccines that we can give out. So I think moving them to the very front, or even in front of those who are most at risk, would be a very bad idea. However, what you might want to do once we've done the initial phase is move teachers up. But what I would caution is that if you're doing this for the reason that it will, it's the most effective use of vaccines, teachers on average in the UK are some of the youngest in the OECD. And those teachers who are older, so head teachers who, they've been in the school system much longer, older teachers, perhaps approaching retirement, they under the current prioritization system will be vaccinated as a priority. So we're then talking about a good chunk, a few 100,000 of maybe you want to move them up in phase 2. Certainly not in phase 1. I think that would be a very bad idea. But it's sort of based on this principle that if we vaccinate teachers now, we will be able to open schools. And as I laid out in the article, closing of schools has almost nothing to do with teacher infection rates. It's not because teachers are getting infected, it's because the case rates in the rest of the country and ICUs are filling up. Now, teachers is a more difficult example. Over the past few days, we've seen the case made that footballers and football associated staff should be vaccinated. And the problem with shifting around and a politicalization of the vaccine priority list is that virtually everybody is going to want a vaccine, and virtually every single industry is going to want their workers vaccinated first. It's entirely rational. Nobody wants to catch this disease. I think that is not a game that the government should really be getting into. And if it wants to vaccinate certain groups faster, the best thing it can do is vaccinate everybody as soon as possible and accelerate the entire vaccination program, rather than picking and choosing different groups, some of which are incredibly, I'm not saying that teachers don't deserve to be vaccinated whatsoever. I'm saying that if we want to get as many people vaccinated as possible, it's better that the government spends its energy accelerating the rollout program.
So much of this discussion will focus on how the government can accelerate its rollout of the COVID vaccine. But I'd just like to deviate from that briefly to talk about the sort of anti-vaxxers or vax-truthers out there who were sowing distrust among the public that development would be rushed and that this would somehow mean that vaccines haven't been properly vetted or that their safety would be in question. Now, a recent poll found that 77% of Brits would be willing to take it. I just wondered, both of you really, what your thoughts were on how worried we should be about vaccine hesitancy and what the solutions could be. For instance, an IEA report that came out before Christmas by the economist Paul Ormerod suggested that we offer people a cash incentive to ensure uptake. Kristian, what are your thoughts on vaccine hesitancy?
I don't see that as a major problem yet. At the moment, the problem is clearly purely on the supply side. And the day when we will have the vaccine available in large quantities, when it will be easy to get it, and where the problem will be that people just don't want to get it because they believe in some conspiracy theories, that will be a good day, because that will mean that we will have picked all the low-hanging and mid-height hanging fruits already. And then we're talking about the difficult cases, but then we will be probably close to herd immunity already anyway. When we get to that stage, there would be nothing wrong with offering a cash incentive, because if it does substantially reduce transmission rather than just protecting the individual that gets the vaccine, then you can make a classic externality argument here. Then it would be the case that the main beneficiary of you getting the vaccine isn't you, it's the people around you who you are now less likely to spread the virus to. And then you really have a case where the social benefit exceeds the private benefit, and then there's nothing wrong with offering some incentives. Now, of course, if you are a hardcore anti-vaxxer, then no amount of, if you really believe that this is going to kill you or maim you or whatever, then no amount of money is going to persuade you. But if it is driven a bit by social media hysteria and partly adopting a social media persona, which I suspect a lot of this is, then then offering some cash incentive would be the way of asking people to put their money where their mouth is, and to see whether those convictions are really only skin deep, and I suspect that they are.
Jonathan, do you agree?
I think if you look at, so the country that everybody's looking at at the moment in terms of how well they're doing with their vaccination program is Israel. And there was some polling done before they started their mass vaccination rollout, with, I think, numbers lower than 70% of adults saying they would take it. And there seems to be a real sort of fear of missing out of getting the vaccine. You know, you don't want to be this sort of social pressure that you don't want to be the person who's not taking the vaccine. That might not transmit, it might not transplant fantastically well over to the UK. I suspect it probably would. And I also agree with Kristian. Well, I do agree with Kristian on the point that a lot of the anti-vaxxers, a lot of it is not done for a certain effect. But I mean, there's lots the government can do and there's lots civil society can do as well in terms of convincing people to take the vaccine. Her Majesty the Queen has been vaccinated. Maybe we need some senior members of the royal family to be shown getting the vaccination. I know in Israel, the Prime Minister there, Netanyahu, he was vaccinated on television. That's something certainly the government can do. Civil society can do it. I think there's been lots of. I think Brian Blessed was tweeting about how he was vaccinated last night. When you do get down to the smaller numbers, I wouldn't really foresee any really large or long-lasting problems in incentivizing people to get with money effectively to pay them off to get a vaccine.
Now, we're talking about vaccine hesitancy as a situation that we would probably feel quite fortunate to be in, it being quite far down the line. So, Jonathan, I just wondered if, for the listeners who haven't read the report that you co-authored for the Adam Smith Institute, whether you could share the top lines. How do we get to a point where way more people have been vaccinated?
So I co-authored a report with James Lawson and Matthew Lesh for the Adam Smith Institute, and we offer 22 ideas that the government could introduce to help accelerate vaccine rollout. In a few weeks' time, and potentially now as well, given that there are supposedly millions of vaccines on shelves not being used, but there's not exactly really clear numbers on this. So take that with a pinch of salt. But I think it is going to be true, or it's going to have a very high certainty that in a few weeks, supply is not really going to be too much of an issue. We're going to have more vaccines approved. We've got 2 potentially in the line in terms of Novavax and Johnson & Johnson, which is tens of millions of more doses. AstraZeneca is going to be, the supply is going to increase, and we are going to get Pfizer vaccines as well. So it's about the main parts of our report were focusing both on supply. So if you don't think that's true, if the government doesn't think that's true, that the supply is going to increase, well, it can incentivize, AstraZeneca. It can pay them a lot more money because currently AstraZeneca is working on a not-for-profit basis. So they're not producing the vaccine for profit. So if you think we're wrong about that if the government thinks we're wrong about that, then there are steps they can take to increase supply. They can pay a lot more. Markets are incredibly innovative when you show them big profits. On the distribution side, the rollout is currently being planned or has been planned by the NHS and Public Health England. most people do not join the NHS to run logistics. And that's the same with Public Health England. If you want the rollout and the logistics side to be sorted, you need to get people who do logistics properly for a living. So we suggest, if the government has access to something called the Royal Logistics Corps in the army, people whose job it is entirely to come up with new solutions to very complex problems when it comes to logistical rollout. Obviously, as well, there are over 11,000 pharmacies in the UK. Big pharmacies like Boots, Lloyd's utilize their distribution networks. Those are sort of the big things that the government can do. Don't be afraid to spend money at this. It's currently costing us more than £1 billion. It's currently costing the government more than £1 billion a day. The IEA probably has a better idea of how much it's actually costing the wider economy a day. There's almost no amount of money you can throw at this problem that it's going to end up being more expensive. Just one last point on the rollouts. Again, if you look at other countries which are doing really, really well at this, to come back to Israel again, they're having large drive-through vaccination centers to get people in. Not everybody has a car, but again, this is not a one-size-fits-all approach. If you have, if we start to offer large drive-in centers, that's again more vaccination centers as well, but also you're mitigating some of the risk because of how coronavirus spreads. It's spread via the air. It's an airborne disease. If you're vaccinating people outside, you're going to massively reduce that risk. So there is a mixed bag. There's a lot in the paper to get through, and it's not one solution in the paper that will solve the entire problem. A mix of them will help to accelerate it.
Kristian, let's discuss the possibility of a privately available vaccine. Now, in an article for City AM, you suggested that we could have a parallel private system, and I suspect this was an article that could have whipped some on the left into a fit of rage. How do you expect this might work in practice?
Yes, the private parallel track was meant to be. I thought of this as a second best solution. So this is not the system that I'm advocating, but I was writing this under the assumption that the NHS and the government would be reluctant to bring in private sector actors, that they would insist on doing it all by themselves, just the NHS and Public Health England. If that happened, you would get a situation where the vaccine is being produced in large enough quantities, where you might even have a small surplus, where production really isn't the problem, but where we just cannot get it into people's arms. So where the distribution is the bottleneck and not the production. In such a situation, I think it would be better if the government can't bring itself to open this process up to private sector actors. If they can't bring themselves to do that, then it would be better to tell private sector actors, you know what, we're not going to work with you, but you can get the vaccine directly from the pharma companies and you can set up your own distribution channel. We will have nothing to do with it, but we will not stop you from doing it if you want to do that in parallel. So you would still have the regular NHS Public Health England route and the private fast track system right next to it. However, this would be a second best solution under the assumption that the NHS just stubbornly refuses to bring in any other actors and does it in such a way that the distribution really becomes the bottleneck in rolling it out. If we did everything that Jonathan and his co-authors are outlining in their report, then what I'm talking about in that column is completely redundant, because then all the distribution networks would be used and then there would be no space left for a private parallel track. That would be even better. So if it were a choice between what I'm describing in that column and Jonathan's report, I would go with their solution, because that would clearly be the first best way of sorting this out.
I should say in our report, we do make the case that pharmacies should be involved. I suspect what probably is going to happen is that they are going to be government funded vaccines distributed via pharmacies. We say that should be, really do utilize all of the pharmacies available. But we also do have an idea in the report about, and it's a little bit more radical idea, but the idea that you could inject yourself. So you could administer the vaccine to yourself and have it delivered to your door. That I think is very much one of the least likely things. But if you were running a parallel system, and if you're prepared to take the risk, if you're young, you're fit, there are checklists which we lay out in the paper. And if you have severe allergies, you probably shouldn't be doing it, and you probably should be doing it under medical supervision. But that again could be if an online distributor wanted to set up a supply with AstraZeneca. I'd also just like to very quickly say that we're talking mainly about Western vaccines here. The Chinese government and the state-owned pharmaceutical companies have produced 2 vaccines. Now, they're lower efficacy than Pfizer and Moderna's vaccines. But if the government was to say, really, if you want to source your own vaccines and sell them, we don't just have to use Western-made vaccines. If there is supply available, then there's no real reason why a private pharmacy couldn't source vaccines from abroad if they were subject to safety reviews in the West.
So, Kristian, I just wanted to touch on some of the points that you made. I mean, at the start of this crisis, we saw Public Health England's centralisation of testing, meaning that the UK missed early cases, and that allowed this uncontrolled outbreak to spiral. And now we have an essential part of the COVID response being hamstrung by a command and control approach and this rejection of the private sector. I just wondered what you think about when the inquiry, when potentially a reckoning comes, when we have time to pause and reflect on the performance of our state institutions over the course of this crisis, and wondered whether you think we'll learn anything from how an over-reliance on the state might hamper our ability to cope with something like this in the future.
Yes, there are some good signs already that we will not exactly repeat the testing fiasco. For example, Boots is going to set up a small number of vaccination centers, so that's all well and good. That's certainly a step in the right direction. But ideally, I mean, this should be up and running already. They should have been involved right from the very first minute. They should have said right from the start, anyone who has the capacity to do this can apply for a contract, and they will be part of the distribution network. And there's no reason why you should limit this to Boots. This should be anyone who knows how to do it, and anyone who has the appropriate skills and infrastructure in place should be part of that effort. And in that sense, yeah, it's really only a small step in the right direction. One of the problems here is that the government is probably just terrified that whenever they involve private sector actors, you get the predictable hysterical columns in The Guardian about how this is a privatization of the NHS through the back door. This happens every time the NHS has some interaction with some private entity. You get the predictable hysteria, and they are, unfortunately, the government is very susceptible to that. And that this is a general problem with the system we have, that even though there are sometimes the government, the NHS does cooperate with the private sector, it always takes a conscious political decision to do that, rather than that just being the default setting. And that is a structural problem with the system we have.
Yeah, it'll certainly be interesting to see what the fallout is from this crisis, whether it will have forced us to look at healthcare systems outside of the UK and US and how we might be able to emulate them and how they've performed, or whether it will just entrench existing sentiments towards the NHS, with us clapping on our doorsteps and, yes, applauding the heroic frontline workers, but also cheering its 72nd anniversary, which was quite bizarre. I wanted to just stay with you, Kristian, to talk a little bit about Israel and how it has stormed ahead in its vaccine rollout, because there have been claims that Israel is leading the race because of its population density, its geography. But has the nation not also benefited from the successes of its healthcare system?
Yes, it's still early days. I wouldn't yet want to link it to specific features of their healthcare system, not least because there are continental European countries that have healthcare systems that are not fundamentally different from the Israeli one, and they are on the slow side as well so far. So we'll have to keep an eye on it and see how it goes. In the case of the European systems, there the problem has been that they've been held up by the approval process. So that was the problem. It could well be that the health systems as such are able to scale this up quickly, and that it was really just the approval side that was the bottleneck. That we'll have to keep an eye on. But it's certainly wrong to link it to population density or geography, because national population density figures are almost always misleading. You get countries like France and Spain that have very low population density figures, but if you visit those places, they don't feel sparsely populated, and that's simply because they have population centers that have density figures like in Britain, like in the Netherlands or Belgium, like the densely populated parts of Europe. It's just that they also have large areas that are almost empty. And of course, if you aggregate that, then you get a much lower number, because these empty areas are dragging down the national average. It's just that the national average doesn't then tell you anything. It would be like population density figures for Sweden or Norway are completely meaningless, because of course they're very low. That's because nobody lives in the north of, or hardly anyone lives in the north of these countries. You get the population clustered in a few population centers in the south, and that would be why I wouldn't use national population density figures for anything really. You could only make.
Sorry.
Yeah, go on.
I think even if that didn't convince you, I mean, it convinced me. But even if it didn't convince you, England has a higher population density than Israel. So even by that very metric, there's no real reason why population density should matter. Israel's rolling out way faster, not just in the UK, but way faster than anyone else. And it doesn't seem that population or geography has really very much to do with it.
Yeah, it could in a couple of months. Let's say if a place like Canada, if they manage to quickly get the population in the big cities vaccinated, but then have trouble reaching the remote areas, or Australia, the same thing, then it would be entirely fair to say, yes, that difference is explained by differences in population density. But we are nowhere near that yet. It's not as if we had already covered the big cities and now struggle to reach the remote areas. We're very far away from that point. So therefore, we can't say anything about population density being a factor yet.
And Jonathan, do you have anything else to add, and to what we can attribute Israel's success? I know that you discussed it a little earlier, but is there anything you'd like to add?
They take it seriously. And I would really like to see, the government has put in a plan. It's done extremely well with its vaccine procurement, particularly compared to other European countries. So in the early stage of the pandemic, there was a huge furore about the number of tests that were being done, and the government set a very ambitious target. And although initially, there was a little bit of criticism as to how they got to that target, they did eventually get there, and they surpassed it. They did really, really well on the testing side. So for vaccines, it would be fantastic to see the government not just try and aim for 2 million, but try and aim for 2 million a day. It's like to really go there, because if you go for a massively ambitious target and you take it really seriously, and you fail, let's say you go for 10 million vaccines a month, okay, and you fail by you fail by 50%, you only get to 5 million. But if you're only targeting 2 million a month and you achieve that, even on your side where you've gone for a really ambitious target and you've failed, you've still got 3 million more vaccines. So that's what I would like to see, like some real ambition to look at Israel and go, not just we could do that, but we could do it even better.
Now, Jonathan, I mean, the purpose of your report was to outline how we can accelerate vaccine rollout, and the reason why we're so desperate to do that is because, as you've said, it's according to an economist at the IEA, or our economics fellow, it's £18 billion a month. I know the SI have run some numbers on this as well, but it's also, of course, saving hundreds, if not thousands, of lives. So there is this desperation to roll out the vaccine as quickly as possible, but it will will also, of course, allow us to get back to our daily lives as they were before March 2020. So I do think that, while lockdown skeptics are now a vanishing minority, I think there are very few kind of on the fringe people who are now objecting to the measures because there is this light at the end of the tunnel. I do also think that that's going to be another front, that we're going to start to have debates over the vaccination tipping point. And already we've got tussles within the government. We've got the COVID recovery group calling for restrictions to be lifted after half term, which is when they'd like to see schools reopening and businesses reopening and a real unlocking of the UK economy. And I just wondered where you stand. How do we identify the right time to emerge out of hibernation, in your view?
So just before we get to that, I'd like to say it's not just about the number of lives saved and the amount of money. We've seen twice, if not more, but we've definitely seen twice, 2 times, where the virus has mutated. We've seen the South African variant, and we've seen the British, the English variant. If we don't accelerate, we genuinely don't know which other ways this virus could mutate. And if you accelerate, if we do vaccinate everyone as soon as possible, we're massively reducing the risk that we get further mutations, at least from the UK. Where I think when we should come out of lockdown is that's everybody wants it to be as soon as possible. My fellow authors don't offer a particular date, time, when that should be. It will probably become possible when we've vaccinated most of the vulnerable, which is either, the target which is currently set at the moment is to vaccinate the most vulnerable, so about 14 million people, of which I am one of them. I have cystic fibrosis. I've been in lockdown for a much harsher lockdown than most people have, because I've been isolating. So it's not like I'm immune to this. I desperately want lockdowns to end and to go back to normal. I would err on the side of caution rather than sending everybody back as soon as half term ends. But I don't have a particular date, and that's my own personal opinion. I would just err on the side of caution, do as many vaccines as possible before you start to lift restrictions, and don't lift restrictions all at once. Lift them slowly.
Kristian, what are your views?
I don't have a threshold either. I would just say we'll have to go back to a localized approach. There will be huge differences across the country. It will depend on local or regional infection rates and hospitalization rates, the extent to which intensive care units are used, and it will have to depend on that. And then, in addition, by that time, when we're talking about lifting the serious restrictions, we'll be in spring. It will be possible to shift a lot of activity outdoors, and that has to be part of the effort. It will be in the beginning, all the focus was on wash your hands and disinfect everything you touch, whereas we now know it probably makes more sense to focus on the fact that it's an airborne virus. It's transmitted in poorly ventilated, crowded indoor spaces. And therefore, the more activity you can move outdoors, the better. And that can be aided through regulatory changes. We had the government made a change during the first lockdown, which was a big success, where they said any restaurant, any pub can now offer takeaway services, even if they didn't have permission to do that before. They made this quick change to planning laws, and you can do something similar with using outdoor spaces, where at the moment there would be restrictions on the basis of noise. You would get neighbors complaining that it gets noisy when you have people standing outside. But this would be a situation where you'd have to say, okay, tranquility is now in this situation a bit of a luxury issue. You can put up with a bit of noise for a few months if that means that we can shift a lot of activity outside and open parts of the economy again in that way.
Jonathan, I just have a final question for you. When Chris Whitty said that restrictions might go on or be reintroduced in the winter, there was this hysterical outrage from those who have been kind of anti-face masks and anti-lockdowns. I wondered what you think winter 2021 and indeed winter 2022 might look like. Do you think that we will see the reintroduction of these restrictions to try and mitigate the spread of the disease? Do you think that enough people will be vaccinated and vaccinated on a regular basis to ensure that it's much like the seasonal flu? What do you think the outlook is for COVID-19 throughout 2021 and beyond?
So I think that's a really, really difficult forecast to make. I think Chris Whitty may have made those comments just to sort of maybe cover himself. Maybe he's right. I do a lot of forecasting. I have over 200 score questions, and I think if I was asked a question like that, I'd want to take quite a lot of time to answer it rather than just be. But I would initially say I think if the government looks like it will probably have got rid of most of the deaths by the end of the summer, probably much sooner than that. Now, COVID may well become a more seasonal thing. I'm a bit reluctant to offer any certain forecasts on that, but if you want to invite me back at any time, and I can maybe go through that. There is a piece on Heard today about forecasting the end of the pandemic, which I'd encourage your viewers to give it a read. It's by a forecaster called Michael Story, and he gathered together a bunch of forecasters to give some estimates on when the pandemic might end.
Well,
that's probably a lot better than just me saying. I wouldn't want to offer any real certainty on this at the moment.
Sure. Well, thank you both Kristian and Jonathan for taking part and for sharing your thoughts in what has been a really interesting and thought-provoking discussion. To those watching, please do consider subscribing to the IEA's YouTube channel and hit the notification bell to never miss a video. We put several up every week. Thanks very much.